Welcome to Thrill Stories, where every story is a new mystery, waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Chapter 1. It was on a particularly bleak morning in late October that I found myself once again seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes in the cluttered sitting room of 221B Baker Street. Outside, the London fog lay thick and oppressive, wrapping the streets in a murky shroud that seemed to seep through the very walls of our quarters. Holmes, as was his habit on mornings devoid of stimulating cases, lounged on the settee in his dressing gown, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his keen eyes fixed on the ceiling in silent contemplation. The fire crackled feebly, doing little to combat the chill that lingered in the room. I had just set aside the morning paper, an uninspiring read that morning, when Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs, followed by a sharp rap at the door. "A visitor, Holmes," I remarked, though my friend's lack of response suggested he had already deduced as much. "Enter," he called languidly. The door swung open, revealing a man in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, yet visibly shaken. His dark overcoat was damp from the persistent drizzle outside, and his bowler hat, which he clutched nervously, dripped onto the rug. His face, beneath a well-groomed mustache, was pale, and his eyes darted about the room before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice tight with anxiety, "I am terribly sorry to intrude at this hour, but I was told you are the only man who might make sense of what has happened." Holmes stirred at last, his gaze sharpening. "Pray, take a seat, sir. Compose yourself. You are clearly distressed, and I am inclined to believe that your case is of some urgency." The man sank into the offered chair, exhaling heavily. "My name is Edmund Carroway. I don't know how else to say it, Mr. Holmes, but my son has vanished without a trace." Holmes sat upright, his interest now visibly piqued. "A missing child, you say? Scotland Yard is surely involved?" "Inspector Lestrade himself," Carroway confirmed, wringing his hands. "But he insists the boy must have wandered off. A child's fancy, he calls it. But Henry is no flighty boy. He would never just disappear like this." Holmes glanced at me briefly, before leaning forward. "Begin at the start, Mr. Carroway. Spare. No detail, however trivial it may seem. Often, what is overlooked proves most illuminating." Carroway nodded, gathering his thoughts. "Henry is 9 years old. Yesterday morning, I walked him to his school on Whitcomb Street, as I do every weekday. He kissed his mother goodbye, cheerful as ever, and there was nothing amiss. But when I returned at 3 to collect him, the headmaster said he never arrived. Not a single soul saw him after I left him at the school gates." Holmes's brow furrowed. "No witnesses on a bustling London street? Curious indeed. I hired a cab to retrace the route. Asked shopkeepers, passers-by. Nothing. It's as though he vanished into thin air." Carroway's voice broke, and he wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "I don't know what else to do." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as his mind turned over the details. "Did your son have any reason to run away? A quarrel? At home? Fear of school?" "None whatsoever," Carroway insisted. "He was a bright boy, full of laughter. My wife is beside herself." Holmes rose abruptly and strode to the fireplace, staring into the embers. "Children do not simply evaporate, Mr. Carroway. If he did not arrive at school, something transpired between your parting and his intended destination. Watson, fetch your coat." "You intend to take the case?" Carroway asked, a flicker of hope in his voice. "Sir," Holmes replied, turning back to him, A boy's disappearance under the watchful eyes of London streets is no ordinary matter. There is a shadow here that warrants investigation. He paused, then added with a hint of that familiar, sardonic smile. Besides, Lestrade's involvement nearly guarantees a misjudgment. As we prepared to leave, Holmes glanced at me. Observe closely, Watson. Such cases often hinge on the smallest overlooked detail. We shall find the boy, or, failing that, the truth of what befell him. Outside, the fog thickened, the gas lamps flickering like distant specters in the gloom. And as we stepped into the cold embrace of London streets, I could not shake the sense that this case would prove far more complex and perilous than it first appeared. Chapter 2. The damp streets of London stretched before us, a labyrinth of cobblestones cloaked in swirling fog. Gas lamps flickered intermittently, their glow casting elongated shadows that danced across slick pavements. Holmes strode with purpose, his long strides carrying him swiftly through the morning gloom. The collar of his coat turned up against the chill. I kept pace beside him, glancing occasionally at our client, Mr. Edmund Carroway, who struggled to maintain Holmes's relentless speed. We turned onto Whitcomb Street, the thoroughfare where young Henry Carroway was last seen. It was a typical London street, bustling with carriages, shopkeepers arranging wares, and passers-by hurrying along their morning errands. Yet, beneath the everyday bustle lay an undercurrent of unease, heightened by the gravity of our task. Holmes halted abruptly in front of St. Dunstan's Preparatory School, a stately brick building with iron gates that stood ajar. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the playground beyond, a poignant contrast to the tension in Carroway's face. "This is where you parted ways with your son?" Holmes inquired, his eyes scanning every detail of the street. The shop signs, the cracks in the pavement, the arrangement of the cobblestones. "Yes," Carroway confirmed. "He always walked through those gates after I left him." Holmes crouched to examine the ground near the entrance, his fingers lightly brushing the damp stone. "There was rain yesterday afternoon. These scuff marks are recent. 2 sets of footprints, one larger, one smaller, diverge from the gate and head toward that alleyway." He rose, pointing to a narrow passage between the school and an adjacent bakery. Carroway's brow furrowed. "But Henry never mentioned any reason to go there." "Children are easily lured or distracted," Holmes murmured. "Yet the absence of witnesses along a busy street suggests something more deliberate." We proceeded down the alley, its walls closing, in with oppressive narrowness. Holmes paused by a discarded sweet wrapper crumpled near a drain. "Watson, observe the brand. Harrison's Peppermints. Popular among school children. Our missing boy may have been enticed with something as simple as this." Carroway's face paled. "You think someone took him?" "I think it unwise to speculate." "Prematurely," Holmes replied, "but abduction cannot be dismissed." Returning to the main street, Holmes's gaze darted toward a nearby newspaper stand. "You there," he called to the vendor, a grizzled man hunched beneath his awning. "Did you see a young boy pass this way yesterday morning? Brown hair, school uniform?" The vendor scratched his head. "Might have. Loads of children come by. Wait, there was a man in a dark coat talking to a boy right near that lamppost yonder. Thought it odd, given how hurried folk usually are in the morning. Didn't pay it much mind, though." "A dark coat," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "And the time?" "About 8:30, sir." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. Your recollection is valuable." We crossed to the lamp-post, its base damp with rainwater pooling in the gutters. Holmes examined the ground meticulously, his sharp eyes missing nothing. A carriage stood here recently. Note the wheel tracks and the imprint of a man's heel, adjacent to smaller footprints. The boy did not stray. He was engaged. Carroway clenched his fists. But why my son? We are not wealthy beyond modest means. There's no reason for anyone to target us. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. Motives are rarely transparent at the outset. A personal grudge, a mistaken identity, or something more sinister. All possibilities remain open. As we moved along the street, Holmes suddenly halted and gestured to a scrap of fabric caught on an iron railing. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I examined it. "A piece of woolen cloth, part of a coat, perhaps?" "Indeed, and, from its weave, likely a school blazer." Holmes's gaze darkened, which suggests the boy was not led away willingly. We resumed our investigation, questioning shopkeepers and passers-by. Some recalled seeing Henry Carroway that morning. Others remembered nothing unusual. The fog of uncertainty thickened with each step. At length, we returned to the school to consult the headmaster, a portly man named Mr. Whitfield, who met us in his office with evident discomfort. "Inspector Lestrade has already questioned us thoroughly, Mr. Holmes. I'm not sure what more I can add." "Humor me," Holmes replied curtly. "Were there any recent incidents involving young Carroway? Bullying? Disputes with staff?" Whitfield hesitated. "None that I'm aware of. Henry was well liked, though there was a new boy, Philip Mercer, transferred here a fortnight ago. Quiet sort, but peculiar." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Peculiar how?" "Speaks of imaginary friends, claims to know things beyond his years." "Harmless nonsense," I assumed. "Children's fantasies rarely intersect with real-world vanishings," Holmes muttered. "Still, I shall like to speak with young Mercer." Unfortunately, the boy had been absent that day. Another dead end, or so it seemed. As we departed the school grounds, Carroway's voice trembled. "Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe Henry is still alive?" Holmes's gaze was unreadable. "I believe, Mr. Carroway, that the boy's fate depends on how swiftly we unravel this tangle. And time, I fear, is not on our side." We walked back toward Baker Street in silence, the fog swallowing our footsteps. I cast a glance at Holmes, noting the familiar furrow of concentration knitting his brow. He was assembling pieces of a puzzle, yet too many fragments remained elusive, and beneath it all lay an unspoken truth. Someone had taken young Henry Carroway, and that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to vanish without a trace. Chapter Leafs. Through the ride back to Baker Street was a silent one. Mr. Carroway sat across from Holmes and me in the hansom cab, his fingers nervously tapping against his thigh. His face was pale, and the weight of uncertainty pressed upon him like a physical burden. Holmes, ever the enigma, sat with his eyes closed, fingertips together, the picture of calm. Yet I knew better. His mind was whirring through the maze of facts, examining every detail with relentless precision. Upon reaching our lodgings, Holmes sprang from the cab and ascended the steps, 2 at a time. "Come, Watson," he called over his shoulder. "There is work to be done, and time is not a commodity we can afford to squander." Inside, Holmes immediately set to his usual methodical routine. He unfurled a large map of the area surrounding Whitcomb. Street across the table, pinning down the corners with a magnifying glass, a tobacco pouch, and an old violin. Red ink lines soon traced Henry Carroway's route, dotted with annotations where witnesses had provided details. "Notice, Watson," Holmes said, gesturing with his pipe. "The boy's intended path from his father's parting at the school gate is less than 100 yards. Yet, somewhere along that route, he vanished in broad daylight. This implies a swift, decisive action, one requiring premeditation and familiarity with the surroundings." I nodded. "And the footprints near the alley suggest he was drawn away, deliberately." "Precisely. Children are impulsive, but not without reason. A familiar face, a promised treat, or—" Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "Or coercion." Mr. Carroway, standing near the window, spoke up hesitantly. "You mentioned something earlier about a carriage?" Holmes turned to him. "Yes. The marks on the road indicate a carriage waited near the lamp-post. Its purpose? Uncertain. But given the timing, it seems likely our perpetrator planned an expeditious retreat." He paced, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "Watson, consider the choice of location. A busy street at a time when parents and children bustle to and from school. The abduction was either daring or the work of someone so seemingly innocuous that none took notice. A teacher, perhaps?" I offered. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Or someone posing as one. Uniforms and familiarity with routines can lend a disarming sense of legitimacy." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a tray of tea, her expression one of maternal concern. "Such a dreadful business, Mr. Holmes. Poor little boy. I do hope you'll find him safe and sound." "We shall do our utmost, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied curtly, but not unkindly. As she departed, Holmes turned to Carroway. "Tell me, sir, have you or your family received any unusual correspondence of late? Letters, notes, even idle threats?" Carroway frowned. "No. Wait." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a crumpled envelope. "This arrived yesterday morning. I thought it nonsense, a childish prank, but perhaps—" He handed it to Holmes. Holmes opened the envelope carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were the words, "Some debts are paid in coin, others in flesh. You have taken. Now you shall lose." A chill swept the room as Holmes read the message aloud. Carroway's face drained of color. I don't understand. I've wronged no one to warrant this." Holmes's gaze darkened. "Someone believes otherwise." I examined the letter over Holmes's shoulder. "The handwriting is deliberately distorted, intended to conceal the author's identity." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and the choice of words is telling. You have taken." "This suggests retaliation, not random mischief." "But I've no enemies," Carroway insisted. "My business is unremarkable. I sell fabrics to local tailors, hardly the stuff of vendettas." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his tone clipped. "Watson, we must revisit the alley. Something nags at me, a detail overlooked." Within minutes, we were once more enveloped by London's foggy embrace. The alley, narrower than I remembered, seemed to swallow us in its damp darkness. Holmes moved with quick precision, eyes scanning the walls and ground. His lantern illuminated discarded rubbish, a broken crate, and muddy footprints already smudged by the morning's foot traffic. Then he paused. "Here," he said, pointing to a brick slightly protruding from the wall. Pressing it inward revealed a hollow recess behind it, a makeshift hiding place. Within lay a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes unwrapped it, revealing a pocket watch, its silver casing tarnished but intricately engraved. Carroway gasped. "That's Henry's! I gave it to him for his birthday. He wears it every day. Holmes examined the watch under the lantern's glow. Stopped at precisely 8:45, the likely time of the incident. But why hide it? I wondered aloud. Message, Holmes said grimly. Our abductor wishes to taunt, to instill fear. Leaving the watch in a concealed spot suggests deliberate orchestration. As we emerged from the alley, a commotion erupted from across the street. A boy, perhaps 12, ran toward us breathless. Mr. Holmes? Holmes arched an eyebrow. Yes, lad? I seen the boy. The one what's missin'. Saw him yesterday, I did. He got into a black carriage with gold trim. Man inside gave me a shillin' to keep mum. But I couldn't sleep last night thinking about it. Holmes knelt to the boy's level. Did you see the man's face? The boy shook his head. Had a scarf pulled up and a hat low over his eyes. But he smelled funny, like flowers and something sharp. Holmes's gaze sharpened. An unusual detail. Well done, young man. He pressed a coin into the boy's palm. Honesty deserves reward. Turning to us, Holmes's expression was grave. A carriage with gold trim is no common sight, nor is the combination of floral and chemical odors. We are dealing with someone wealthy and dangerous. Carraway's voice trembled. What does it mean? Holmes's eyes glinted with that familiar fire. It means, Mr. Carraway, that our adversary is no amateur. This is a game of calculated moves, and we have just witnessed the opening gambit. Chapter 4. The streets of London seemed to grow darker despite the rising sun, as Holmes, Carraway, and I made our way back toward Baker Street. Fog coiled through the alleys and squares like a living thing, casting every gas lamp's glow into a halo of uncertainty. Holmes walked ahead, his face a mask of contemplation. He twirled his walking stick absent-mindedly, his thoughts no doubt navigating the labyrinthine complexities of the case. Carraway, beside me, remained pale and drawn. I don't understand, he murmured. Why would someone go to such lengths? Henry is just a boy. This isn't the act of a simple kidnapper, is it? No, Holmes replied without turning. This is something far more calculated. Kidnappings for ransom are crude affairs. This is a message, a personal vendetta shrouded in layers of deception. Carraway's brow furrowed. But I've wronged no one. Truly, I haven't. Perhaps not knowingly, Holmes said, his tone sharp, but not unkind. Enemies often arise from unseen places, Mr. Carraway. Our task is to locate the source of that animosity before further harm befalls your family. Back at 221B Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He sprawled papers and notes. Across the table, a map of central London prominently displayed. He drew a circle around the school and marked spots where witnesses had seen the black carriage with gold trim. 3 sightings, he muttered, each pointing toward the north side of Bloomsbury. I glanced at the map. That area hosts numerous boarding houses and private clubs. Indeed, but carriages of such opulence are rare and not likely to go unnoticed. Watson, you will accompany me to the Registry of Carriage Licenses. Mr. Carraway, I suggest you rest here until our return. Your nerves are frayed, and exhaustion aids no one. Carraway reluctantly agreed, collapsing into an armchair. Just find my boy, Mr. Holmes. I beg you. Holmes nodded curtly, and we were soon navigating the maze of London streets once more, the fog thinning as noon approached. At the registry, a harried clerk greeted us, adjusting his spectacles with a sigh. Gold-trimmed black carriages? Rare, yes, but not unheard of among certain circles. Holmes produced a slip of paper bearing the carriage description. I require the names of all owners registered with such vehicles within the last 2 years. The clerk grumbled but complied, returning with a short list. Holmes scanned it swiftly, his eyes halting midway down. Lord Percival Montague, he read aloud. A man with known financial dealings in textiles. Textiles, I echoed. Mr. Carraway's business. Exactly, Watson. Holmes folded the list neatly into his pocket. Lord Montague's residence is not far. Let us pay him a visit. Montague Manor loomed over the surrounding buildings, an imposing edifice of gray stone and wrought-iron gates. A liveried footman admitted us with hesitation, leading us through a grand foyer into a richly furnished drawing-room. Moments later, Lord Percival Montague entered, a man in his 60s with silver hair meticulously combed back. His sharp features conveyed both refinement and something colder beneath. Mr. Holmes, Montague greeted with a tight smile. I must say I was surprised by your sudden arrival. To what do I owe this unannounced visit? Holmes wasted no time. I require information regarding the whereabouts of your carriage yesterday morning, Lord Montague. Montague's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon? A boy was abducted in Bloomsbury. Witnesses place a carriage matching yours at the scene. A coincidence, perhaps, but one requiring clarification. Montague's face darkened. My carriage was at my disposal yesterday. I was at my club on Hanover Street from 8 until noon, as many gentlemen can attest. Holmes's gaze didn't waver. And your driver? Jameson. Loyal for 20 years. He would not act without my instruction. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Yet loyalty is no shield against coercion or bribery. Montague's jaw clenched. You are suggesting my staff are involved in some criminal enterprise? Preposterous. Then you'll have no objection to my speaking with Jameson directly. Reluctantly, Montague summoned his driver, a wiry man with thinning hair and a nervous demeanor. Under Holmes's piercing gaze, Jameson fidgeted. I was at the stables, sir. As usual, he stammered. Didn't leave, except to take his, lordship to the club. Holmes leaned forward. And no one else touched the carriage? No errands or instructions prior? Jameson hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Well, there was a note, sir. Came early mornin'. Said to bring the carriage round back for inspection. Stablemaster's orders, I thought. But when I asked later, he denied it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. An impostor, then. Someone with knowledge of the manor's routines, and enough audacity to intercept the carriage unnoticed. Montague's face was a mask of fury. I'll have my entire staff questioned. Do so, Holmes replied coolly. But discretion is advised. Panic breeds silence. Outside, Holmes lit his pipe, exhaling thoughtfully. Montague's connections to the textile industry are not mere coincidence. Yet I sense a deeper thread, someone who manipulates from the shadows. The floral and chemical scent the boy described, I recalled. Perfumes, or perhaps a manufacturing plant? Precisely, Watson. A factory or apothecary nearby could explain. The odor. We shall investigate. As we turned the corner, Holmes suddenly stopped. Across the street stood a small flower shop, its windows displaying arrangements amid rows of bottled scents. Above the door, a faded sign read Edelweiss and Kornber's Perfumeries. Holmes's smile was razor-thin. Sometimes, Watson, the best hiding place is in plain sight. We stepped inside, greeted by the mingled fragrances of lavender, rose, and something sharper beneath. a chemical tang that pricked the senses. A woman emerged from the back, a middle-aged figure with neatly pinned hair and an air of polite disinterest. "Good afternoon," she said. "Looking for a gift, gentlemen?" Holmes's eyes flicked over the bottles, noting their arrangement with practiced ease. "Perhaps, but I wonder, do you supply perfumes beyond retail? Private commissions? Perhaps for more nefarious purposes?" The woman stiffened. "Sir, I run a respectable business." Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "Respectable fronts often conceal darker ventures. I shall like to speak with your employer." "I am the proprietor," she replied icily, "and I resent—" Before she could finish, a door behind the counter creaked open. A man emerged, tall, thin, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to pierce through us. "Is there a problem?" he asked, voice smooth but edged with something colder. Holmes studied him a moment. "That depends. Were you aware your establishment's scent was recognized by a boy moments before he vanished yesterday morning?" The man's expression didn't flicker. "I've no idea what you're implying." Holmes smiled faintly. "No? Then I suggest you enlighten me before I start tearing apart every inch of this place." Chapter 5. The man standing before us in the perfumery exuded calm, but Holmes's sharp gaze detected the subtle tension in his shoulders and the calculated neutrality in his eyes. He was a man accustomed to control, now faced with something unpredictable. Sherlock Holmes. "I assure you, gentlemen," the man said smoothly, "we have nothing to do with any missing child. Our business is above board." "Your assurances," Holmes replied, "are of less consequence than the facts." He glanced around the room, eyes flitting over the neatly arranged glass bottles lining the shelves. "The air is thick with jasmine and bergamot, but there is another note beneath it. Acetone and benzoin resin, components used not only in perfumery, but in certain chemical solutions." "I fail to see how that relates to your inquiry," the man responded, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. Holmes's tone sharpened. "A boy was seen entering a carriage that bore the distinct scent emanating from this establishment. Are we to believe that is mere coincidence?" Before the man could answer, the shop bell chimed as Watson stepped aside to let a delivery boy enter, balancing a wooden crate. The label caught Holmes's eye: Edelweiss and Commodore, special order. Holmes stepped forward swiftly, intercepting the crate. "Now see here," the proprietor protested. Holmes ignored him, producing a pocket knife and deftly slicing the twine. Inside lay rows of small corked vials containing a pale, viscous liquid. Holmes uncorked one and brought it to his nose. "An unusually strong sedative solution, Watson," he murmured. "Commonly used in veterinary practice. Lethal in large doses, incapacitating in smaller ones." The man's composure began to crack. We supply various clients, bespoke requests." Holmes's gaze turned icy. "And does that include aiding in the abduction of children?" "Do not insult my intelligence with evasions, sir." "Names." Now, the man hesitated, glancing at the woman behind the counter, whose face had turned ashen. Finally, he sighed. "Look, I don't know about any abduction, but a man came in last week, ordered a batch of chloroform and these sedative vials, paid double the asking price for discretion." "Description?" Holmes demanded. "Average height, lean build, wore gloves, never removed them, had a scar along his jaw, and he carried a faint scent himself. Tobacco mixed with something metallic." Holmes nodded slowly. "A working man, possibly industrial, machinist or foundry laborer." The woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "He said he worked for someone powerful, someone we wouldn't dare cross." "Did he mention a name?" Holmes asked. "Only an initial," she whispered. "Said his employer went by M." Holmes exchanged a glance. With me, his expression tightening. The initial, combined with the complexity of the plan, hinted at something larger than a simple vendetta. Someone orchestrating events from behind a veil. "Where was the delivery to be made?" Holmes pressed. "Dockside warehouse," the man replied. "Pier 7, midnight 2 nights ago." Holmes pocketed the vial. "Watson, we visit the docks immediately." The journey to the Thames was shrouded in a growing sense of urgency. The fog thickened near the river, blending with the smoke from steamships and the brackish scent of the water. The docks bustled with laborers unloading cargo, their shouted orders echoing against the warehouses lining the wharves. Pier 7 loomed ahead, deserted, save for a lone watchman who offered no resistance when Holmes flashed to Scotland Yard, credential he had acquired through his many collaborations with Lestrade. Inside the warehouse, darkness pressed in. Holmes produced a lantern, its glow casting long shadows across crates and rusted equipment. The air was thick with damp wood, old salt, and something else, faintly chemical. There, I pointed to fresh footprints in the dust, men's boots, and smaller prints consistent with a child's. Holmes crouched, studying them intently. 2 men, guiding a boy. No struggle. The boy was either compliant or rendered unconscious. He paused, fingers tracing the floor. Dust displaced recently. Crate moved. "Watson, assist me." Together we heaved aside a large wooden crate, revealing a hatch leading downward into what appeared to be a disused storage cellar. The darkness below seemed to swallow the lantern light. Holmes descended first, his steps echoing ominously. I followed, heart pounding. The cellar was small and dank, walls lined with rotting shelves. Holmes's lantern swept across the space, then halted. On the floor lay a handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.C. Carraway's boy. "Confirmation," Holmes muttered, pocketing the cloth. "We're close." Further exploration revealed a hidden door at the rear, partially ajar. Beyond it stretched a narrow tunnel, walls damp and coated with mildew. "Smuggler's Passage," Holmes noted. "Leads beneath the streets, perfect for clandestine movement." As we advanced, distant voices echoed ahead. Low, urgent whispers. Holmes raised a hand. "Quietly now." We crept forward until the passage opened into a small chamber lit by an oil lamp. 2 men stood arguing. One matched the shopkeeper's description: scarred jaw, gloved hands. The other was shorter, nervous. "I told you," the shorter man hissed. "He's on to us. Holmes is sniffing about. Found the shop already." "Shut it," Scar growled. "We finished tonight. Orders from M. No loose ends." Holmes sprang forward. "Consider them unraveled." Chaos erupted. Scar lunged, pulling a knife, but Holmes deflected it expertly with his cane, striking the man's wrist and sending the blade clattering. I grappled with the shorter man, who flailed wildly before Holmes intervened with a precise blow that sent him sprawling. Breathless, I straightened. "Good Lord, Holmes!" Holmes had already turned, eyes scanning the chamber. "Where is the boy?" Scar spat blood. "Too late. You'll never find him." Holmes knelt, pressing his cane against the man's throat. "You mistake me for someone patient." "Where?" Scar gasped. "Safe house. Old carriage house. East End." Holmes released him. "Watson, tie them. We have no time to lose." Outside, the fog seemed thicker, as if London itself conspired to conceal the truth. Holmes hailed a cab. "East End! Harrow Lane! Quickly!" And indeed, the cab rattled through the streets. Holmes's face was grim. "An orchestrated network, Watson. Resources, manpower, and motive obscured behind an initial. M? Who benefits from Carroway's suffering?" I shook my head. "Someone with means and a personal vendetta." "Precisely. And I fear we stand on the edge of something far larger than a simple abduction." Chapter 6. The cab careened through the fog-choked streets of London, wheels rattling against uneven cobblestones as Holmes leaned forward, cane tapping impatiently against the floorboards. His sharp profile, illuminated by the flickering gas lamps outside, was etched with concentration. I sat beside him, adrenaline surging through my veins, the urgency of our mission hammering in tandem with the hooves striking the pavement. "Holmes," I ventured, glancing at the dark blur of the city rushing past, "this carriage house in the East End. Do you believe the boy is still there?" "Hope, Watson," Holmes said curtly, "is a luxury we indulge in sparingly. Logic dictates urgency." They anticipated pursuit, yet not with the speed we've mustered. There remains a chance, provided we arrive before they vanish anew. The fog thickened, swallowing street corners and cloaking the world beyond the cab. Window in shifting gray. Somewhere out there, Henry Carroway, a 9-year-old boy, waited, his fate suspended between the shadows and our haste. The driver cracked his whip, urging the horses faster. "Nearly there, Gov," he called back. "Harrow, lane's just ahead." Holmes pressed a coin into the man's hand. "Wait for us. We shan't be long." The cab skidded to a halt, and we stepped out onto a desolate stretch of Harrow Lane. The surrounding buildings sagged with age, their windows boarded or shattered, like blind eyes watching our progress. Holmes scanned the street, his gaze honing. In on a dilapidated carriage house partially obscured by ivy and neglect. "There," he whispered. "No guards. Uncharacteristic. A trap, perhaps." "Should we wait for Lestrade?" I asked. "No time. We proceed carefully." Holmes produced a slender lockpick from his coat, deftly working the rusted padlock until it snapped open with a dull click. He pushed the heavy doors inward, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, darkness reigned, broken only by the faint orange glow of a lantern hanging from a rafter. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of old tools. Holmes moved with measured steps, eyes sweeping the shadows. Then a sound, a muffled sob. Holmes held up a hand, signaling silence. We crept toward the source, navigating around. Discarded wheels and rotting crates. Behind a stack of barrels, huddled and bound, was Henry Carroway. His face was streaked with grime, eyes wide with fear. "Henry," Holmes murmured. "Stay calm, lad. We're here to help." I dropped to one knee, working at the ropes binding the boy's wrists. "It's all right, son. You're safe now." Holmes's gaze flicked around the room. "Watson, quickly." I trying?" A click echoed through the space. I froze. The unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked. "Step away from the boy," a voice drawled from the shadows. Holmes turned slowly, hands raised. A figure emerged. A tall man clad in a long overcoat, a scarf concealing the lower half of his face. His eyes were cold, calculating. The scar along his jaw confirmed our earlier description. "You're the one they call Holmes," the man said. "Reckon I should have dealt with you sooner." "And yet here we are," Holmes replied, Your mistake was underestimating the speed of deduction. The man smirked beneath the scarf. M figured you'd come poking. Told me to stall you long enough. Stall for what? I demanded, glancing at Holmes. Holmes's expression darkened. To ensure the true objective proceeds unhindered. The realization struck like a hammer blow. Henry was the distraction, I breathed. There's something else. Holmes nodded grimly. While the city's attention is diverted by this high-profile abduction, another scheme unfolds in the shadows. The man's grip tightened on the revolver. Doesn't matter. You'll not be walking out. Holmes's eyes darted upward. Watson! Now! Instinct took over. I shoved Henry to the ground as Holmes swung his cane, knocking the revolver aside. The weapon discharged with a deafening bang, the bullet embedding in a nearby beam. Holmes lunged, striking the man's wrist with precision. The gun clattered away, and they grappled, the struggle fierce and breathless. I pulled Henry to safety, shielding him as the two men fought. Holmes ducked a wild swing, retaliating with a blow to the man's ribs. The assailant stumbled but lashed out again, until Holmes delivered a final decisive strike to his temple. The man collapsed, unconscious. Watson! Holmes panted, straightening. The boy, take him to the cab. What about you? I must search this place further. M doesn't waste resources on mere diversions. Reluctantly, I guided Henry outside, the boy clinging to my arm. The cab driver's eyes widened. Blimey! Found the lad, did ya? Keep him safe, I ordered. And if anyone approaches, drive like the devil himself chases you. Inside, Holmes combed through the carriage house. His lantern illuminated papers strewn across a makeshift desk. Maps, coded notes, and a ledger bearing transactions linked to various London addresses. His gaze narrowed at a single entry. Montague. Shipment. Secured. Final phase. Parliament. Parliament, he murmured. This isn't about the boy. It's political. An attack or blackmail? Footsteps approached. I returned, breathless. Holmes, we must go. He stuffed the papers into his coat. Agreed. This reaches beyond Caraway. It threatens the city itself. Back at Baker Street, Caraway embraced his son, tears of relief streaming down his face. Thank you. God bless you both. Holmes offered a curt nod, but his mind was elsewhere, eyes fixed on the documents. This puzzle deepens, Watson. The abduction was a smokescreen. We've pulled back one veil, only to find another. And the man we captured? An expendable pawn, Holmes said grimly. But this M, they orchestrate something far larger. Parliament is mentioned, and time is running out. A knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson peeked in. Inspector Lestrade to... See you, Mr. Holmes? Lestrade entered, his usual skepticism replaced by urgency. Holmes, there's been a breach at the Parliament archives. Guards incapacitated, documents missing. We've reason to believe it's connected to this Caraway business. Holmes handed him the ledger. No reason to believe, Lestrade. Certainty. Lestrade scanned the pages, paling. If this is accurate, it is, Holmes said. We stand at the edge of a precipice. Whatever M intends, it strikes soon. Lestrade straightened. Then let's stop them. Holmes glanced out the window. Fog swirling, beyond the glass. Indeed, Inspector. The game escalates, and I fear the next move will shake London to its core. Chapter 7. The fog hung heavier over London that night, as if the city itself had drawn a thick blanket around its shoulders to hide from the treachery brewing beneath. Holmes paced the length of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the scattered May papers from the captured ledger lying in careful arrangement across the table. His eyes, sharp as ever, flitted between the coded entries, his mind racing ahead of the visible clues. Inspector Lestrade sat opposite, arms crossed, his usual impatience replaced with grim determination. "Holmes, this is more than we bargained. 4. Parliament targeted? That's high treason. Worse, if they succeed. Which is precisely why we shan't allow them to," Holmes replied curtly. "This isn't mere political dissent. M orchestrates something far more insidious, something that hinges on timing, precision, and deception." I glanced at the map pinned to the wall, the red threads Holmes had strung between various points, resembling a spider's web. The abduction of young Carroway was a smokescreen, I mused, designed to divert attention from Parliament's security. "Correct, Watson." Holmes halted before the fireplace, the flickering flames casting long shadows across his face. While the city fixated on the missing boy, M's agents infiltrated Parliament's archives. The question is why. Documents of that nature suggest blackmail. Or worse. Lestrade's jaw tightened. "We've got officers posted at every entrance, but if you're right, when," Holmes corrected. "Not if," Lestrade sighed. "Right. When. Then we'll need something more than just men with truncheons." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Precisely why. I've devised a trap." I leaned forward. "A trap?" Holmes tapped the ledger. "This entry. Montague. Shipment secured. Final phase. Parliament. Montague's textile warehouses grant them a convenient means of smuggling materials unnoticed. Bomb components, perhaps, or forged documents. Tonight, they move. We shall be ready." Lestrade frowned. "And how do you propose we catch them?" Holmes smiled thinly. "By becoming the bait." 2 hours later, we stood within the echoing halls of the Palace of Westminster. Gas lamps flickered along the high stone walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across statues and vaulted ceilings. Lestrade had deployed his best men, plainclothes, officers stationed at key corridors, blending seamlessly with the night's lingering staff. Holmes, clad in a simple worker's coat and cap, surveyed the surroundings with practiced ease. They'll strike where oversight is weakest, perhaps through the underground passages beneath the building. Lestrade gestured toward a servant's stairwell. "Leads down to the archives and maintenance tunnels." Holmes nodded. "Then that's where we lie in wait." We descended into the bowels of Parliament, the air growing colder and damper with each step. Flickering lanterns illuminated narrow passages lined with ancient brickwork. Holmes paused at a junction, kneeling to examine the floor. Footprints, fresh. 2 men, heavy-set, carrying something. Lestrade drew his revolver. "This is it." Holmes raised a hand. "Patience, Inspector. A trap sprung too soon yields nothing." We crept forward, boots silent against the stone. Ahead, voices murmured, low, conspiratorial. Holmes signaled us to halt as we reached an alcove, peering around the edge. 2 figures stood near a stack of crates, prying one open. Inside glistened sticks of dynamite, wires coiled like snakes ready to strike. "Right on schedule," Holmes whispered. "Watson, circle left. Lestrade, right flank. On my mark." Heart pounding, I slipped through the shadows, positioning myself behind a rusted pipe. Across the chamber, Lestrade mirrored my movements. Holmes waited, timing, always timing, until the taller man reached for a detonator. "Now!" Holmes barked. We surged forward. The would-be saboteurs spun in shock, but Lestrade tackled one man, knocking the detonator aside. I grappled with the other, his elbow catching my ribs before Holmes struck him down with his cane. Breathless, I secured the man's wrists. "Got him?" Lestrade cuffed the other. "You boys picked the wrong night." Holmes approached the dynamite crate, eyes narrowing. Enough explosives to level half the wing, crude, yet effective. He turned to the captured men. "Who ordered this? Speak, or I let the inspector's patience run its course." One man spat at the floor. "You're too late. M is everywhere." Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "Then it's time to cut off the head." We returned topside, the dynamite confiscated, and the prisoners in custody. Yet Holmes's expression remained unsatisfied. Outside, the city's fog had thickened, curling. Around the Houses of Parliament, like a protective shroud, Lestrade wiped his brow. "We've got them, Holmes. Plot foiled. Should be celebratory, no?" Holmes shook his head. This was the second phase. M anticipated interception, which means the final act unfolds elsewhere. "But where?" I asked. Holmes glanced at the city beyond. The river, the silhouetted dome of St. Paul's, the glow of gas lamps stretching toward the horizon. Then his eyes fixed on a single location, a stately manor illuminated against the night. "Montague's estate," he murmured. He feigned ignorance, "but I sense a puppet or a puppet master. Either way, we find answers there." Lestrade groaned. "You just love cutting it close." Holmes smiled grimly. "Life, Inspector, thrives on deadlines." Montague Manor loomed ahead, its gates barred. Holmes scaled them with practiced ease, and we followed into the sprawling grounds. The house was dark. Too dark. "Empty?" I whispered. Holmes's gaze swept the facade. "Or waiting." He approached a side door, lock-picked in moments. We slipped inside, the air thick with polish and perfume. Holmes led us through silent halls, every creak underfoot a gunshot in the quiet. Then a voice echoed faintly. "He's here." Holmes froze. "They know." A trap door sprung. Armed men poured forth, faces masked. Chaos erupted. Lestrade fired. Shouts rang out. I ducked behind a column, adrenaline burning. Holmes moved like a shadow, dodging, striking, every motion precise. I caught glimpses, fists connecting, men falling. Then, stillness. Bodies sprawled across the floor. Lestrade cuffed survivors. Holmes stood, breathing hard. "Upstairs," he said. "The mastermind waits." We ascended. A final door loomed. Holmes paused, hand on the knob. "Prepare yourself, Watson. What lies beyond changes everything." He pushed it open. Inside sat Lord Percival Montague. Calm, smiling. A revolver rested on the table, untouched. "Ah, Holmes," Montague drawled. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You orchestrated this?" "Not quite," Montague replied. "I merely facilitated." "On whose orders?" Montague's smile widened. "Why, M's, of course." "And who is M?" Montague leaned back. "Closer than you think." Holmes's expression darkened. "Explain." But Montague's gaze shifted. Past us, footsteps sounded behind. We turned, and there, framed in the doorway, stood a figure I never expected. Familiar. Chilling. Holmes's eyes widened fractionally. "You," the figure smiled. "Hello, Holmes. Fancy meeting you again?" Shock rippled through me. "Holmes! Who is—" but Holmes was already stepping forward, gaze cold as ice. "I thought you dead." The figure's grin widened. "Rumors of my demise. Exaggerated." Chapter 8. For a moment, silence reigned in the grand study of Montague Manor, broken only by the faint ticking of an ornate clock above the fireplace. The figure standing in the doorway was tall, immaculately dressed in a dark suit tailored with precision. His eyes, pale and piercing, flickered between Holmes and me with a familiarity that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Holmes stood, motionless. His usual composure, so rarely disturbed, seemed stretched taut. His voice, when it came, was low and edged with steel. "Colonel Sebastian Moran." The name struck me like a physical blow. "Moran?" I echoed. "But, Holmes, you said he—" "Escaped justice," Holmes finished grimly. "After Moriarty's demise at the Reichenbach Falls, Moran vanished. I presumed him either dead or in hiding. It appears I was only half correct." Moran's smile was sharp and cold. "It's been a long time, Holmes. I wondered if you'd recognize my handiwork. Seems I haven't lost my touch." Lestrade, recovering from his initial shock, stepped forward, revolver raised. "Colonel Moran, you're under arrest." "I wouldn't," Moran interrupted, voice a velvet threat. "This house is wired with enough explosives to send us all to kingdom come, if I so much as whistle." Lestrade hesitated. Holmes's gaze flicked toward the walls. Bare, but concealing who knew what. His voice softened, calculated. It was you all along." Moran bowed mockingly. Montague here was useful. Connections, resources, but he lacked vision. Unlike Moriarty, whose shadow looms long, I intend to finish what he began. I swallowed. Destroying Parliament, killing innocent people. What purpose does that serve? "Chaos," Moran replied simply. "Fear. Governments crumble when the populace loses faith. And amidst that collapse, men like me rise." Holmes's jaw tightened. "And the boy? What of Henry Carraway? A pawn in your twisted game?" "A means to an end," Moran said with a shrug. His father's company provided critical materials. The boy was leverage, simple arithmetic. Holmes stepped closer, eyes locked with Moran's. "You miscalculated. I found him." "For all the good it did you," Moran shot back. "You think stopping. A single shipment derails the plan. Parliament was a distraction. Bait for you, Holmes. I knew you'd follow the trail just as predictably as ever." Holmes stilled. "Then, what is your true target?" Moran's smile didn't falter. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The room felt colder, the walls pressing in. Lestrade's hand trembled slightly on his weapon. "Enough talk. Hands where I can see them, Moran." "You never did understand the bigger picture, Lestrade," Moran sighed. "Holmes does, don't you? The world teeters on a knife's edge. Men like me, we're just giving it the final push." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "And after? Ruin for the sake of ruin. Or does your ambition stretch to a throne built on ashes?" "Ashes can be fertile ground," Moran replied. "From destruction, rebirth." It was then I noticed Holmes's right hand, subtly moving within his coat pocket. His voice remained even. "Your philosophy remains as warped as ever." "I call it clarity," Moran countered. "And soon—" A sharp click echoed. Holmes withdrew his hand, holding a small device. Moran's smile faltered. "Wireless jamming," Holmes said. Your detonators won't respond now. Moran's mask of control cracked. You? Lestrade moved. Drop it, Moran! Moran's jaw clenched, but he raised his hands. Montague paled, shrinking back as officers poured into the room. Lestrade cuffed Moran swiftly, securing him with practiced ease. Holmes exhaled slowly. One must always anticipate the next move, Colonel. Moran glared. This isn't over, Holmes. Men like me don't vanish. Holmes met his gaze. No, but they do fade. Eventually. Outside, dawn broke over London, casting the city in a pale golden hue. The fog, at last, began to lift. Lestrade clapped Holmes on the shoulder. Couldn't have done it without you, Holmes. Parliament's safe. The boy's home. Blasted miracle. Holmes nodded absently, gaze distant. I stepped beside him. It's over then. His lips thinned. For now. Men like Moran don't orchestrate such schemes alone. There are always layers. And M? I asked. Moran claims the title. But if he was merely filling Moriarty's void— Precisely, Holmes murmured. Moriarty's empire crumbled. But seeds were sown. Not all have been unearthed. I frowned. So this isn't the end. Holmes's gaze lingered on the horizon. Criminal networks are like hydras, Watson. Cut one head. Two may emerge. Yet even as he spoke, the city awakened. Carriages rumbling, shopkeepers opening shutters. Life pressed on. Undeterred by the darkness, it narrowly escaped. Holmes turned at last. Come, Watson. I find myself craving Mrs. Hudson's tea. We've had enough darkness for one night. I smiled. Agreed. And as we walked away from Montague Manor, the first rays of sunlight spilled across the cobblestones, banishing shadows, if only for a moment. Chapter 9, The warmth of the sitting room at 221B Baker Street was a welcome reprieve from the cold weight of the night's events. Mrs. Hudson, ever the attentive housekeeper, despite her occasional protests against Holmes's unorthodox activities, placed a steaming pot of tea on the table with a concerned glance toward us. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, I heard about that dreadful business at Parliament. London owes you a debt, I dare say. Holmes offered a faint nod, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. His pipe lay untouched on the mantel, a rare omission that spoke volumes to me about the weight of the case still pressing upon him. I poured 2 cups of tea, placing one beside him. Drink, I urged gently. You've been running on sheer will since yesterday. Holmes accepted it absently, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. I settled into the armchair opposite, exhaustion threading through my limbs. The events of the past 2 days, the abduction, the confrontation at Montague Manor, Moran's chilling revelations, lingered in my mind like a fog refusing to lift. Outside, the streets hummed with the life of a city, oblivious to how close it had come to disaster. Newspapers had not yet caught wind of the true nature of the plot, and perhaps that was for the best. Panic could be as dangerous as the schemes we had foiled. Breaking the silence, I asked, What troubles you, Holmes? Moran is in custody. The dynamite seized. Parliament is safe. Surely that's victory. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. Victory, yes, but incomplete. Moran is a tactician, a deadly one, but even he does not conjure such elaborate schemes alone. He hinted at a broader network. M was a symbol, a mantle beyond Moran's ego. I frowned. You believe there are others? I am certain of it, Holmes replied. Moriarty's criminal web spanned continents. His death created a void, yes, but also an opportunity for those ambitious enough to claim it. I rubbed my temple, and Moran sought to fill that void. Exactly. But consider this. Why abduct Henry Carraway? Why orchestrate such a public distraction while simultaneously infiltrating Parliament? The plan relied on layers of deception. Moran was confident. Too confident. Which means, he paused, eyes narrowing, there may be plans set in motion, beyond those we uncovered. The thought sent a chill through me. You think we've only peeled back one layer? Holmes nodded. Criminal enterprises thrive on redundancy, fail-safes. If Moran is captured, someone else ensures the final stroke lands. A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson reappeared, ushering in Inspector Lestrade. He looked exhausted, but carried a certain satisfaction. "Gentlemen," Lestrade greeted, removing his hat. "Thought I'd stop by with an update. Moran's locked up tight. We're sweeping through Montague's records. More names cropping up. Businessmen, politicians. Looks like that ledger you found opens more doors than we thought." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Any leads on higher command?" Lestrade grimaced. "Nothing concrete. Moran's tight-lipped. Claims he's the top of the ladder. But I've known enough criminals to spot a lie." Holmes murmured, "Of course, a good general shields his superiors until the last." Lestrade hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We found communications encrypted with a code we can't crack. Thought you might lend a hand." Holmes's eyes lit with renewed purpose. "Leave them here. I'll see what I can do." Lestrade placed a folder on the table. "We're combing through Montague's properties. Seems he financed several shell companies, used them to funnel funds for, well, who knows what yet. Keep pressure on every link," Holmes advised. "When networks collapse, they do so at the weakest points." Lestrade nodded, then glanced at me. "Henry Carraway's back home safe. His father sends. His gratitude swears he'll name his next born after you, Holmes." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." After Lestrade departed, a comfortable silence settled, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. I watched Holmes flip through the documents, his brow furrowing as he scanned coded messages. His mind, a relentless engine, refused rest even when the storm had seemingly passed. "Holmes," I said after a moment, "you did it. You saved lives. Don't let what remains overshadow that." He glanced up, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something rare. Weariness. "Sometimes, Watson," he said quietly, "success reveals only how much remains undone." I let the words hang, understanding. Holmes thrived on the pursuit, the chase. Victory was fleeting. The next case, always calling. The grandfather clock chimed the hour. Outside, dawn gave way to a clear morning sky, the fog finally lifting, if only for now. Holmes leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. "Tell me, Watson, do you ever wonder if the world spins on a razor's edge of chaos, and we're simply the ones keeping it balanced?" I smiled. "Only when I'm around you, old friend." His laughter, soft and genuine, echoed through the room. For now, at least, the darkness had been held at bay. And yet, somewhere in London's winding alleys, shadows still moved. Games played, pieces shifted. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, there was tea, warmth, and, just for a moment, peace. The days following Colonel Sebastian Moran's capture brought a fleeting calm to London. The newspapers, ever eager for scandal, buzzed with tales of the Parliament plot and Holmes thwarts treason. though the true intricacies of the Ibabi case remained obscured by necessity. Inspector Lestrade, now something of a reluctant hero in the public eye, made his rounds delivering terse statements, while Holmes, characteristically indifferent to fame, retreated into the sanctuary of 221B Baker Street. It was in those quieter hours that I found him as he so often was, lounging in his armchair by the fire, his violin resting against his knee, fingers absent-mindedly plucking strings in a discordant melody. A haze of tobacco smoke curled through the room, mingling with the faint scent of Mrs. Hudson's lavender polish. Scattered across the table lay the remnants of the case, coded documents, discarded drafts of decrypted messages, and the ominous ledger that had set the entire affair into motion. I glanced at the morning paper in my hands. "They're calling you the Guardian of Westminster now," I remarked with a half-smile. "Quite the title," Holmes snorted. "Journalistic embellishment. The public's appetite for heroes surpasses their understanding of the complexities beneath." "Still," I pressed, "you saved lives, prevented catastrophe. There's no denying that." He waved a hand dismissively, standing to pace the room. "A temporary reprieve, Watson. Moran was but one branch of a larger tree. Severed, yes, but roots remain. This network is vast, interconnected. Montague's cooperation, while valuable, illuminated only the fringes. And yet," I countered, "Henry Carraway is safe, his family whole again. That matters." Holmes paused at the window, gazing out over Baker Street. A carriage rumbled past below, and children's laughter echoed faintly from a vendor's stall. His expression softened. "Yes," he murmured, "that at least is something." A comfortable silence stretched between us until Mrs. Hudson appeared, bearing a silver tray with fresh tea. "Another letter for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, setting the envelope on the table. "Marked urgent it is." Holmes arched an eyebrow, accepting the letter. His slender fingers broke the seal, and his eyes scanned the contents. For a moment, his expression remained inscrutable. Then a spark of intrigue ignited behind his gaze. "Well?" I prompted. He handed me the letter. The handwriting was precise, deliberate. "Mr. Holmes, I trust you've found the Parliament affair stimulating. Consider it a prelude. Greater games lie ahead, and I, for one, look forward to our next encounter. London's streets hide many secrets, some darker than you know." I exhaled slowly. "They're still out there." "Of course," Holmes said. "Moran was a blade. Someone else wields the handle." Lestrade's words from days prior echoed in my mind. "When you cut off the head of a snake, make sure another doesn't grow back." Chillingly, it seemed the serpent's coils stretched far beyond what we had imagined. Holmes poured himself a cup of tea, the china clinking softly against the saucer. "The letter was hand-delivered," he noted. "No postmark. Which means they were here, Watson. Close." I glanced at the window, half expecting to spot a figure lurking in the mist. But the street bustled as always, mundane, indifferent to the hidden games unfolding in its shadow. "So what now?" I asked. Holmes smiled, a flash of that familiar spark, equal parts brilliance and danger. "Now, we wait. They've made the next move. I shall respond in kind." I leaned back, absorbing the weight of it all. Another case, another chase. With Holmes, the wheel never truly stopped turning. He drained his tea and reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings. A rich, haunting melody filled the room, a song of tension and release, of questions unanswered. Outside, the city moved on, its heartbeat steady against the backdrop of intrigue. After a moment, Holmes spoke without looking at me. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever wondered how far the darkness beneath London's surface truly stretches?" "Every time we peel back a layer," I replied, "we find another beneath." He smiled thinly. "Precisely." The violin's notes swelled, echoing against the walls, and in that music, I heard it. The pulse of the city, the whispers of plots yet to unfold, the ever-present shadow of the next mystery. For now, the boy was safe. The city stood unscathed, but somewhere, beyond gaslit streets and fog-wrapped alleys, M watched, waiting, planning, and Sherlock Holmes, ever vigilant, waited too. The game, after all, was never truly over. End of Sherlock Holmes and the Vanishing Boy.